Have you ever noticed how confidence is often treated as a prerequisite for action, when in reality it's usually the consequence of it? My name's Paul, and I'm an Oxford qualified psychologist who teaches people how to learn more easily and live more fully. I'd like to reframe our understanding of confidence because I think it's less a personality trait that you either have or don't, and it's more something that emerges from the interaction between competence, perception, and exposure. If you can see how those three fit together, confidence becomes far less mysterious and far more buildable. Let's start with a common assumption, which is that confident people believe in themselves more. Well, that sounds reasonable, but it is slightly misleading, because belief doesn't arise in a vacuum. It's usually based on some form of evidence, either real or perceived. So, for instance, I'm confident speaking in front of large groups of people because I've done it literally thousands of times, and I have data that it goes well. But unlike Hyacinth Bouquet, I am not confident in my ability to horse ride because I've almost never done it, and not at all, for over 30 years. Albert Bandura's work on self-efficacy is useful here. He showed that confidence in your ability to do something is largely shaped by what he called mastery experience. In other words, having actually done the thing or something close to it before, like me addressing large groups. So competence feeds confidence. That part's relatively straightforward, but to make it more interesting, confidence is not just about actual competence. It's about perceived competence, and those two are not always aligned. This is where Leon Festinger's theory of social comparison comes in. We tend to evaluate our abilities relative to others. So if you're surrounded by people who appear more capable, your perception of your own competence may decrease, even if your absolute ability has not changed. Equally, if you're in an environment where you feel relatively strong, your confidence can increase without any actual improvement in skill. That makes it disadvantageous for all involved if you deliberately surround yourself with quote-unquote losers, to borrow a phrase. It may make you feel smarter, but it really doesn't mean that you actually are smart. So, confidence is partly a social construct. It's shaped by our context and not just by our capabilities. And then we add a third layer, exposure. From a behavioral perspective, particularly drawing on principles associated with Skinner, behavior that is repeated becomes easier, more fluent, and less effortful over time. The first time you do something, it feels awkward. The 10th time, less so. The 100th time, it may very well feel completely natural. So what we often label as confidence is, in many cases, simply familiarity. You may well have seen content by Vanessa Van Edwards, and I think she's worth mentioning here. Her work on social behavior and communication suggests that many behaviors associated with confidence, so eye contact, vocal clarity, posture, are not innate traits, but they're learned patterns, and they can be practiced, refined, and improved. These points lead me to a conclusion that may feel uncomfortable to you. If confidence is largely the result of competence, perception, and repeated exposure, then waiting to feel confident before acting is, in many cases, expecting the cart to pull the horse. You're waiting for the outcome before engaging in the process that produces the outcome. If this way of thinking is useful, by the way, you might find the rest of this channel helpful too. What I'm giving are frameworks that you can apply across different areas rather than just isolated bits of advice. So, do consider subscribing. Click. Now, let's bring this into something more recognizable. Imagine someone who says, "Oh, I'm not confident at speaking in public." Well, that may very well be true subjectively. But if you look at the underlying components, a few things tend to be present. They may have limited experience speaking publicly, which means low exposure. They may be comparing themselves to highly polished speakers, which distorts their own perception of their abilities. And they may not yet have developed the specific skills involved, which affects competence. So the lack of confidence is not a single problem, it's the natural outcome of those three interacting factors. And yet the intuitive response is often to try and feel more confident before attempting it again, which is rather like trying to become fit before going to the gym. I really still hope that might work. Anywho, there's also a slightly ironic dynamic that appears quite often. People who are highly capable in one domain can feel quite unconfident in another, not because they lack ability, but because they lack exposure. Think of me in horse riding once more. And because they're used to performing well, the idea of being a beginner again can feel uncomfortable. So they avoid it, which prevents exposure, which prevents the development of competence, which maintains the lack of confidence. And so often as in our lives, we're stuck in a self-reinforcing loop. This is where behavioral activation becomes particularly useful. Originally developed in clinical psychology, especially in the treatment of depression, it's based on a very simple idea. Action usually precedes motivation, not the other way around. You do the thing first, often in a small, manageable way, and the psychological state follows. Applied here, it suggests that confidence is something you build through engagement, not something you wait for before engaging. Now, none of this is to say that subjective feelings don't matter. They do. Feeling anxious, uncertain, or self-conscious is entirely real, and I do encourage people to be emotionally conscious and mindful. But those feelings are not always reliable indicators of your actual ability or your potential. They're often just reasonable reflections of unfamiliarity. And unfamiliarity, by definition, changes with exposure. Furthermore, even when you watch someone who appears confident, it's very easy to assume that they feel internally composed, certain, and at ease, when in fact what you're seeing is often not the absence of discomfort, but the ability to act despite it. The behavior comes first, the feeling gradually aligns with it. And this is perhaps where the misunderstanding becomes most limiting. If you believe that confidence is something that you must possess before acting, you delay the very experience that would allow it to develop. Whereas if you treat confidence as something that emerges from doing, even ineptly, then the path forward becomes much clearer. You don't need to transform your personality. You need to adjust the sequence. Act, then evaluate. Engage, and then refine. Expose yourself, and then adapt. But by the way, expose yourself means do the activity. I don't want any of you actually exposing yourself. Disclaimer. And over time, what once felt unfamiliar becomes familiar. What once felt effortful becomes fluid. And what once required conscious effort begins to happen, bit at a time, on a kind of autopilot. So the next time you find yourself thinking, I'm just not confident enough, it may be worth translating that into something more specific. Do I have enough experience here? Am I comparing myself in a way that distorts my perception? And have I given myself enough repeated exposure for this to start feeling natural? Because once you break down confidence into those components, it becomes less of a fixed trait and more of a process which you are able to influence. And as always, if you did find any of these ideas useful, well, perhaps give a follow. Bye-bye. Bye-bye now.